You think you can run an operation in a neighborhood like this and nobody's going to notice? Lay down. Don't you move a muscle. He said it the way men say things when they are absolutely certain no one in the room will question them, the way a person speaks when 19 years of a particular kind of power has convinced him that the woman on the floor exists in a completely different category of human being than the man standing over her. Shane Pruitt was 28 years old, 2 years into a career that had already generated 3 internal escalation flags his supervisor had reviewed and quietly filed away, and he was crouched in the kitchen of a Georgian estate at 7 Renfield Drive in Caldwell Heights, Charlotte, North Carolina, at 2 in the morning, pressing his advantage against a black woman in a silk robe who had placed her water glass on the marble island and turned to face him with her hands open before he had even finished clearing the door frame. He had no idea who she was. That is the fact this entire story rests on, the fact that makes everything that follows not just inevitable, but necessary. The woman on the hardwood floor of that kitchen was Dr. Vivian Okafor, 53 years old, sitting judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. The woman whose signature currently governed every policy, every procedure, and every career inside the precinct that had just sent Shane Pruitt through her front door. She was not going to file a complaint in the morning. She had already begun building the federal case against him from the moment his partner's boot touched her spine. But to understand how this night arrived, you have to go back 6 weeks, to the Tuesday the moving trucks came. Caldwell Heights sat on the elevated western edge of suburban Charlotte, like a neighborhood that had decided some decades ago that the best version of itself was the one it had already achieved, and that the job going forward was simply to protect it. The driveways were Belgian cobblestone hand-laid by crews who arrived before the first resident opened a window. The lawns were maintained by contracted services that disappeared before anyone had to acknowledge them. The homes here did not appear in public listings, and if you needed to ask the price, you had already revealed that you were in the wrong conversation entirely. And everyone who lived on these streets understood that without ever needing it, explained to them directly. Vivian Okafor did not ask permission to arrive. She purchased the Georgian estate at 7 Renfield Drive, outright wire transfer, clean closing, efficient moving trucks, rolling up the cobblestone driveway on a Tuesday in late September, when the oak trees along the property's perimeter were just beginning to turn copper at the edges. The house was extraordinary in the way that certain rooms are extraordinary, not for what they display, but for what they hold. And when the listing agent pushed open the study doors on the tour, Vivian had stopped walking entirely, because 3 walls of floor-to-ceiling legal volumes arranged by year and jurisdiction felt less like something she was looking at and more like something that had been waiting for her specifically. On the corner of the desk sat a hand-carved wooden gavel, smoothed pale at the grip, by years of daily use, a gift from her mother, on the morning of her federal investiture, engraved along the handle in clean lettering. The Honorable Judge Vivian Okafor, U.S. Court of Appeals, Fourth Circuit. On the corner shelf beside the window hung a small framed photograph, the glass slightly curved with age, showing a teenage girl in a yellow dress standing beside a woman in a church hat on the steps of a courthouse, both of them squinting into the afternoon sun. Both of them smiling in the way people smile when they believe without any evidence to the contrary, yet that the building behind them belongs to them as much as it belongs to anyone. Her nephew Jordan visited on alternating weekends, filling the house with laughter and basketball in the driveway and the comfortable noise of a young man who had been raised to feel safe in his own skin. The house was quiet the rest of the time, purposefully quiet. The kind that belongs to someone who has worked very hard for a very long time and has finally earned a room of her own. She had no idea what was already being said about her across the street. Philip Granger had been the president of the Caldwell Heights Homeowners Association for 12 uninterrupted years, and he wore that title the way other men wear military rank, as a primary identity, as daily confirmation that he was the person who decided how things worked in a place worth deciding things about. He was 61, retired from a senior vice presidency at a regional bank he had joined at 29, and risen through with the particular combination of calculated patience and institutional loyalty that organizations tend to mistake for wisdom, and he had moved to Caldwell Heights in his early 50s as a reward to himself for a career he considered exceptional by any reasonable measure. He was not an obviously cruel man. He did not shout at neighbors or make scenes at association meetings or say out loud the things he believed in a way that could be directly quoted or attributed. He operated instead through a refined and thoroughly practiced machinery of social management, the pointed observation delivered in the register of genuine concern, the steering vote arranged in advance with 2 or 3 key members before the meeting began, so that the outcome was a foregone conclusion that could still be presented as community consensus. The carefully worded message in the neighborhood text chain that raised an alarm without ever specifying exactly what the alarm was about, leaving the imagination of the recipients to fill in the spaces with whatever fears they had been carrying quietly and had not yet been given permission to name out loud. He had built 12 years of influence through this machinery, and it had worked beautifully because in Caldwell Heights, the machinery was invisible to the people who benefited from it, and only fully visible to the people it was designed to manage. Within 48 hours of the moving trucks appearing at number 7, Philip Granger was at his bay window with his coffee watching. He watched the government-plated SUVs arrive in the evenings dark and tinted, driven by a suited detail who never got out of the vehicle. He watched Jordan on the weekends shooting baskets in the driveway before dinner, a young black man in a neighborhood where young black men were not part of the established pattern, and his mind moving through channels of assumption worn smooth by decades of unchallenged certainty, arrived at conclusions that had nothing to do with what he was actually observing. He started the neighborhood text chain on a Thursday. Has anyone noticed the increased vehicle traffic at the new property on Renfield Court? Just want to make sure we're all paying attention. That's what a community is for. The Kemper couple 2 doors down from number 7 recently arrived and still very much in the process of auditioning for belonging responded within 3 minutes. 2 other residents offered cautious agreement, and one asked whether the HOA should request a meeting with the new resident to review community expectations. Granger did not respond to that suggestion because a meeting would have required a direct conversation, and a direct conversation would have given the other party an opportunity to speak, which was precisely the kind of dynamic he preferred to avoid. He filed the first HOA complaint within a week. The hedges along the Renfield Drive side of the property were by his measurement 4 inches above the permitted height as specified in Article 7 of the Community Covenant. A check arrived from a Charlotte law firm's billing address 3 days later, signed by a paralegal, accompanied by no personal note and no acknowledgement of any kind beyond the payment itself. He filed the second complaint on a Tuesday. Noise ordinance, classical piano music audible from the back porch at 8:15 in the evening, music that Granger had needed to walk around to the side gate of his own property to hear. Paid the same way within the week. The third complaint cited an unauthorized community gathering 6 adults on the porch in the October warmth plates of food audible conversation. Paid the same way. She never called him. She never wrote. She never appeared at his door or sent a representative or acknowledged the complaints beyond satisfying their stated terms through the billing address of a law firm whose name he did not recognize and could not find in the Charlotte Bar directory when he looked, because it was a Washington firm, and he had not thought to search beyond the state. She gave Philip Granger absolutely nothing to engage with. No visible frustration, no defensive response, no indication that the complaints were registering as anything more than minor administrative transactions. And this total and unhurried silence infuriated him in a way that he could not have named cleanly if anyone had asked him to try, because the infuriation was rooted in something he was not prepared to examine directly, which was the fact that her silence communicated with perfect clarity that she did not consider him a serious obstacle. He stood at his window on a Tuesday evening in mid-October watching the SUV pull away from number 7 and watching the single warm light come on in the study at the far end of the upper floor, and the frustration that had been building in him settled slowly into something harder. something that felt to him in the way that comfortable people often mistake their prejudice for principle, like civic responsibility. He drove 2 towns over on a Wednesday afternoon and paid cash for a prepaid phone at a gas station off Route 49. He parked his registered Cadillac Escalade directly in front of the store's exterior security camera without noticing it, because it had genuinely not occurred to him that anyone would be looking for him specifically, because in 61 years, no one had ever looked for him specifically. He made the call from the far end of his garage with the door closed and his voice lowered, and he had rehearsed it enough that it came out with the breathless, specific conviction of a man describing something he had genuinely witnessed, rather than something he had invented at his kitchen table over 2 evenings and a bottle of Bordeaux. He described in fabricated detail armed figures moving along the perimeter of the property after dark. Large black duffel bags transferred between vehicles in the early morning hours. A persistent chemical odor emanating from the direction of the detached garage that he characterized with a particular confidence as consistent with the kind of production he had read about in news articles. He gave the address as 7 Renfield Drive, Caldwell Heights. When the tip line operator asked if he wished to leave his name, he said no. He feared for his safety if it became known that he had called. He drove home, made dinner, watched 2 hours of cable news, went to bed. Across the street, the warm light in Vivian's study was still on at 11:30, then at midnight, and then at 1 in the morning because she was working through a particularly difficult argument in a 40-page federal consent decree that she was scheduled to hear oral arguments on in less than 14 hours, and she had not yet found the answer she was looking for, which was not unusual because the answers she sought were never simple ones, and she had never once in 23 years of legal practice been willing to stop looking before she found them. She was still at her desk when Philip Granger's tip landed in the system, flagged high priority, routed to the narcotics division of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department's 14th precinct, where a detective sergeant named Carl Braddock would read it the following morning over his first cup of coffee, and feel before he had finished reading the warm anticipatory satisfaction of a man who has just spotted an opportunity that other people have overlooked. Carl Braddock was 46 years old and had been with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department for 17 years, long enough to have developed a particular kind of institutional fluency that is less about understanding the rules than about understanding which rules are enforced and which ones exist primarily for documentation purposes. He was compact and hard-faced, the kind of man whose expressions had narrowed over the years into a small repertoire of functional variations, none of which involved uncertainty, because uncertainty in Braddock's professional self-image occupied approximately the same space as weakness, which was to say, no space at all. His reputation in the narcotics division rested on results, not on process, not on the kind of careful evidentiary construction that holds up through 6 layers of appellate review, but on numbers, arrest numbers, seizure weight numbers, the quarterly figures that command reviewed and that determined with a directness that everyone in the division understood, and nobody discussed openly who got the good assignments, who got the commendations, and who got the kind of institutional protection that translated into a career that could survive the occasional complaint without leaving a permanent mark. Braddock understood this mathematics the way a man understands the grammar of his native language, not as a set of explicit rules he has memorized, but as an instinct so deeply embedded that he could not have separated it from his professional identity if he had wanted to, which he did not. He read the Caldwell Heights tip on Thursday morning, and felt it immediately the particular pull of a high-profile location, a wealthy zip code, the kind of address whose name in a press release would do more for quarterly perception than 3 routine busts in lower-income neighborhoods combined. He did not drive by 7 Renfield Drive to assess the property. He did not run the license plates of the vehicles registered to the address, which would have returned Department of Justice registrations within 4 seconds of the query. He did not check the county property tax records where Vivian Okafor's name and federal judicial title appeared at the top of the first page of the first search result, because checking would have taken 7 minutes, and 7 minutes felt like a delay. He did not need when the picture in his head was already this clear. He called a circuit court judge he had worked with on 3 previous warrant applications, a man who had learned over the course of those 3 applications that Braddock produced results, and that the paperwork, while occasionally thin on corroboration, was always technically sufficient. He constructed the affidavit almost entirely from the anonymous tip's own language, adding the phrase credible intelligence from a community informant to the framing and submitting it the same afternoon. The no-knock warrant was signed by 9:30 that evening. He assembled his team in the briefing room after the shift change. Shane Pruitt, 28, 2 years and 3 escalation flags in his personnel file that had been reviewed by a supervisor who believed that a certain amount of aggression was an asset during forced entries, and that the complaints had come from people who did not understand what a forced entry required. Pruitt had a quality that Braddock had come to value above almost any other. In an entry officer, he did not stop to ask whether the order he had been given was right. He simply executed it with the full weight of his conviction that executing it was the point, and that questions were for people who had not yet committed to the work. And Dale Weston, 33, 8 years in quiet, in the way that men are quiet when they have made a private arrangement with themselves to follow rather than lead, because following requires you to be responsible for less and responsibility. In Weston's experience of this particular division was something that tended to land on the people who could least afford it. Braddock put the aerial image of the property on the wall screen and traced the entry points with a laser pointer. Pruitt was slightly forward on the balls of his feet the way he always was, before an entry energy looking for somewhere to go. Weston was nodding with the steady, mechanical rhythm of a man moving through a familiar sequence. The briefing took 22 minutes. Not one of them across those 22 minutes thought to pull up the name of the person who lived at 7 Renfield Drive and type it into a search window. The bust was the point. The name was a detail for afterward. The night was muggy in the particular way that Charlotte holds on to warmth in October, the calendar insisting on autumn while the air ignores it entirely, and Caldwell Heights was motionless under a sky that had gone fully dark by 9, every house sealed and quiet. The cobblestone driveways empty, the contracted lawns silver gray under the distant street lamps that the HOA had approved at the subdued wattage and warm tone that the architecture committee preferred. Vivian was in her study. The desk lamp threw a warm circle across the 40-page consent decree, which she had been working through since 10 o'clock. Her reading glasses low on her nose, a glass of water on the coaster to her left. The carved gavel at its usual place on the corner of the desk within the natural reach of her right hand, the framed photograph of herself and her mother, visible in her peripheral vision from the shelf by the window whenever she looked up. She had found the answer to the qualified immunity argument she had been wrestling with for 2 days, had written 4 pages of tight notes on the yellow legal pad, and was now working backward through the opposing counsel's brief to make sure she had not missed a counter-angle that would require a different approach in the morning. It was good work, careful and satisfying in the specific way that difficult legal work is satisfying when you can feel it coming together with the precision it requires. And she was entirely inside it when she decided, just before 2, that she needed to stand up and get some water and let her eyes rest for 5 minutes. She walked to the kitchen in her silk robe, feet bare on the cool hardwood, her mind still turning over the brief's 3rd section. She filled the glass at the tap. She stood at the marble island. The world exploded. The flashbang detonated on the front porch with a concussive percussion that rattled the fine china in the cabinet above the refrigerator and sent a bolt of physical shock through the structure of the house. And a fraction of a second later, the heavy mahogany front door was blown completely off its hinges and crashed onto the marble foyer tile with the sound of a car accident in a confined space. Glass from the side lights spinning across the floor in every direction, and the voices came through the opening in a layered, practiced wall of sound designed to overwhelm the senses before a response is possible. Police, get on the ground. Get on the ground now. Hands. Show me your hands. Vivian placed her water glass on the marble island with a careful, deliberate movement. She did not run. She did not scream. She turned slowly and completely to face the hallway and her hands came up on their own palms. Open fingers spread the posture of a person who has nothing to hide and knows exactly what she is doing, and she stood at the center of her kitchen and waited. Pruitt was first through the archway. Rifle up the red laser dot moving across the countertops and settling on the center of her chest. His voice carrying the aggressive, slightly unhinged energy of a young man who has spent 2 years confusing volume with command. Weston came through behind him and positioned himself in the doorway, and in that first second before Pruitt had finished his third order, Weston's eyes moved across the kitchen and then across the woman standing at the island, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. A small, involuntary recalibration that he suppressed before it could become visible, because the operation was already in motion. And Weston had not in 8 years developed the habit of stopping an operation to ask whether it should be stopped. "I am unarmed," Vivian said, and her voice was the steady, resonant instrument of 11 years of federal courtrooms trained to carry across rooms full of people who did not want to hear what she was saying. "You are making a grave mistake." Pruitt did not wait. He covered the distance in 3 long strides and swept her legs with the forward momentum of his full body weight, and she hit the hardwood with enough force to drive the air from her lungs in one sharp, involuntary compression. Before she could draw breath, Braddock's boot came down between her shoulder blades, pressing her flat against the floor with a force that served no tactical purpose and communicated something entirely different from containment. Dale Weston, in the doorway, looked at the floor. The zip ties cinched around her wrists with a yank that bit immediately into the skin at her ulnar bones, the throbbing pressure of compressed circulation radiating up both forearms in a dull, insistent pulse. Her cheek was against the cold hardwood. She could see the baseboards, the underside of the marble island, the corner of the cabinet where the china was still rattling faintly from the percussion of the flashbang. And she did what 23 years of high-pressure legal work had trained her to do in the moments when everything is trying to make you stop functioning. She cataloged. Badge numbers on chest plates, belt configurations, voice pitch, the exact sequence of every order given since the door came off its hinges. She noted the time on the microwave clock above the refrigerator, 2:07 in the morning. She filed it. She was already building the case methodically and without pause, because she had been building cases since she was 25 years old, and she had never once lost one that mattered. Pruitt crouched so his face was close to hers, the adrenaline still bright in his voice, and asked where the stash was, where she thought she could hide an operation in a neighborhood like this without someone noticing, told her to save the federal charges talk because he'd heard it from people with a lot more to back it up than she had. He was enjoying it. Vivian turned her head and looked up at him from the floor, and her expression was not afraid, and it was not angry, and it was not the expression of someone who needed him to understand what he was doing. It was the expression of a woman performing a thorough and unhurried inventory of a man who did not yet know what he had walked into. Dale Weston pushed open the double mahogany doors at the end of the hallway, expecting the visual grammar of a criminal operation, the scales, the vacuum-sealed stacks, the industrial equipment of an enterprise that would justify everything that had happened in the kitchen in the past 8 minutes. His flashlight swept the room in a wide arc. 3 walls, floor to ceiling, packed with the dense working volumes of a serious legal practice. The Federal Reporter series spanning 4 decades of decisions, United States Code annotated, Supreme Court reporters going back to 1990, state statutes arranged chronologically, legal briefs in binders with color-coded tabs organized by circuit and year. Not a decorative shelf, not the kind of books that people purchase by the foot to fill a room that needs filling, but a working library built by someone who had actually read every volume in it and had arranged them according to a logic that was immediately apparent to anyone who had ever spent time in a law school or a federal courthouse. Weston lowered his weapon. He stepped further into the room, his boots sinking slightly into the deep pile of a Persian rug that he recognized without being able to articulate why, as the kind of rug that costs more than his car. At the center of the room sat a massive cherry wood desk, organized with a precision that spoke of professional discipline at the highest level, Not tidiness as a personality trait, but the working order of someone whose decisions had consequences that she could not afford to lose track of. A yellow legal pad covered in tight, exact handwriting, a gold fountain pen uncapped beside it, reading glasses folded on top of an open brief. The brief had handwritten margin notes on nearly every page. And then his flashlight found the objects on the desk's corner. The hand-carved wooden gavel, pale and smooth at the grip, the wood warm-toned with age and daily handling. He read the engraving along the handle, slowly moving his lips slightly over the words without making a sound. The Honorable Judge Vivian Okafor, United States Court of Appeals, Fourth Circuit. He stood very still. He moved the beam to the corner shelf by the window where a small framed photograph showed a teenage girl in a yellow dress and a woman in a church hat standing on the steps of a courthouse, both of them squinting into the afternoon sun. He looked at the girl's face for a moment longer than was necessary. Then the walls, certificate of appointment, the formal federal document, heavy paper, official seal, signed at the bottom with the unmistakable signature of a sitting president of the United States. Department of Justice, Award for Civil Rights Excellence in Prosecution, awarded twice, both plaques mounted beside each other. Harvard Law School magna cum laude. Fourth Circuit seal above the window. And the photograph, large and recently framed, showing the woman who was currently zip-tied on the kitchen hardwood, standing in her full federal judicial robes beside the Attorney General of the United States at what appeared to be a formal DOJ ceremony held in the past 18 months, because he recognized the AG's face from the news and knew the man had only been confirmed to the position 2 years ago. Weston stood in the center of that study and felt the entire architecture of the evening shift beneath him, the way the ground feels in the first second of an earthquake, before the mind has accepted what the body already knows. His voice, when he found it, had lost every note of authority it had carried for the past quarter hour. Sarge. The word came out rough and stripped bare. Sarge, you need to come look at this. Braddock arrived in the doorway expecting a concealed compartment or a false wall panel, the kind of discovery that would justify the warrant, confirm the tip, and close the story in the way he had already written it in his head. He hit the light switch on the wall, and the room filled with warm, even light that removed every shadow and made everything in it completely, irreversibly visible. He read the certificate of appointment. He read it twice slowly, his eyes moving from the seal at the top to the signature at the bottom, and then back up to the name in the center where the type was slightly larger than the surrounding text. He looked at the gavel. He looked at the photograph of Vivian in her robes, standing beside the Attorney General, and he studied the AG's face for a moment to confirm what he already knew, that this was a recent photograph of the current AG, not a predecessor, not an archival image, but a photograph taken within the past 2 years at the most. And then the nausea arrived. It came on with the specific, unmistakable quality of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of what he has done. Not the partial version, not the version he might be able to argue his way through, but the complete and final version. And it moved through him in a cold wave that started somewhere behind his sternum and radiated outward until his hands went still and his face lost its color, with a completeness that made Weston, watching him from across the room, take a half-step backward, as though whatever had just hit Braddock might somehow spread. He knew that name. Every law enforcement officer in the state of North Carolina knew that name the way a person knows the name of something they have been warned about and have not entirely believed until this moment. Judge Vivian Okafor had 14 months prior placed the Mecklenburg County Narcotics Division, the neighboring unit whose officers drank at the same bars and attended the same union meetings as Braddock's team, under direct federal receivership, following a sustained pattern of civil rights violations documented over 6 years. She had not negotiated a settlement. She had not accepted a corrective action plan with a monitoring period and a series of benchmarks. She had dismantled the command structure from the top down, removed its leadership, and installed federal oversight in its place with the precision of someone who had been preparing for that moment for a long time. Braddock had attended the union meeting the week that ruling came down. He remembered the room. He remembered what the officers called her. Shane Pruitt jogged in from the hallway holding a decorative lockbox he had forced open with a screwdriver, his face still bright with the particular high of a successful entry, looking for the validation of a good find. Braddock told him to put it back, his voice barely above a whisper. Pruitt blinked, looked around the room, looked at Weston's face, and then at Braddock's, and the grin began its slow and irreversible evacuation. He read the gavel. He read the certificate. He looked at the photograph. The lockbox slipped from his hands and landed on the Persian rug with a muffled sound that in the silence of the study felt entirely too loud. The three men stood in that room and understood each in his own way, and at his own speed, exactly what they had done. Then they walked back down the hallway in single-file weapons at their sides, pointed at the floor. The practiced confidence of men executing an authorized operation entirely gone, replaced by the slow, heavy movement of people walking toward something they desperately wished they did not have to reach. Vivian was still on the kitchen floor. She had not moved from the position they had put her in, not because she was unable to, but because she had made a deliberate choice to remain exactly where they had placed her until someone came back to face what had been done in this room, because the position itself was evidence, and she understood with the clarity of a lawyer who had spent 2 decades handling evidence that every moment she stayed in it added weight to what she was already building. The zip-tie bruising on her wrists had deepened from red to a vivid settled violet that she noted with clinical precision and catalogued alongside everything else. Her cheek had left a faint impression in the hardwood from the sustained weight of her head. The microwave clock above the refrigerator now read 2:24. She tracked them as they came back through the archway, and she read everything she needed in the first 2 seconds. The collapsed posture. The absence of anything that had resembled authority 17 minutes ago. The particular quality of Braddock's pallor, the gray-white of a man who has just had something very large removed from his inventory of certainties. Dale Weston's eyes, which would not quite settle on her face and kept moving to a point slightly to the left of where she was, which was the eye movement of a man who is ashamed and has not yet decided what to do with the shame. She had presided over hundreds of evidentiary hearings, depositions, sentencing arguments, and the kinds of cross-examinations where a person's entire constructed version of events begins to fracture under the simple sustained pressure of being looked at directly and asked to repeat themselves. She could read the body language of men who had just discovered the terms of their own destruction as easily as she could read a brief. She spoke before any of them did. "You went to the study," she said, "and it was not a question, and it was not an accusation, and it was not the statement of a person who had been waiting for someone to explain themselves to her. It was the flat, absolute certainty of a judge reading a finding of fact into the record." Braddock opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "Tell me something, Sergeant." Vivian's voice was quiet, and it filled the room completely, because it was the voice of a woman who had never once needed volume to be heard. "When you read my name on that judicial appointment certificate, the one signed by the President of the United States and mounted on the wall directly below the Fourth Circuit seal, did you recognize it immediately, or did it take you a moment to connect it to the federal oversight mandate that your narcotics division has been operating under for the past 9 months? The silence in the kitchen was the kind of silence that has weight and texture. The refrigerator hummed. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked the half-hour. Nobody moved. "Look at me," she said. "I am going to ask you to look at me, Sergeant, and I want you to think very carefully about what you see, because what you see right now is the person who, as of this exact moment, is building the federal case against you. Not tomorrow morning. Not when the sun comes up. Right now on this floor. I have been memorizing your badge numbers and your voice patterns and the exact sequence of every order given in this house tonight since the moment your partner's boot came down on my spine. I have been doing that since 2:07 in the morning, and I have not stopped." Nobody had an answer. Nobody tried to provide one. She found Weston's badge number on his chest plate without shifting her gaze from Braddock's face. "Officer Weston, take these off of me, right now, Weston reached for his trauma shears. His hands were not entirely steady, and he dropped them, once recovered them, and knelt beside her on the hardwood floor. It took him 3 attempts to make the cut cleanly. The plastic fell away. The relief of circulation returning was immediate and sharp, and radiated through both forearms in a flood of sensation that she allowed herself to register and then set aside. She placed both palms flat on the hardwood floor. And then she looked at the floor for one moment that had nothing to do with the men in the room, because in that moment, before she pushed herself up, her eyes found the framed photograph of herself and her mother, the one that had been on the corner shelf by the study window, which had apparently been knocked to the floor during the search of the room and had skidded into the base of the island, where it now lay face up. The glass cracked in a diagonal line across the image, the teenage girl in the yellow dress and the woman in the church hat still visible through the crack, still standing on the courthouse steps, still squinting into the afternoon sun. She looked at it for the count of 2 breaths. Then she looked back at Braddock, and whatever had moved through her expression in those 2 seconds locked itself away completely and did not reappear. She pushed herself up from the floor without assistance and without hurry, with a deliberateness that was its own statement about what had been done to her and what she thought of the men who had done it. She stood to her full height. She smoothed the front of her silk robe with both hands. She took one breath and addressed Braddock directly for the first time while standing. "You pressed your boot between my shoulder blades while I was on this floor. Compliant, unarmed, in my own home, in my nightgown at 2 a.m. You did that because you looked at me and saw precisely what an anonymous phone call told you to see, and you never once questioned it because questioning it would have required you to consider the possibility that the woman on that floor might be someone whose name you should have known before you destroyed her front door." She paused, letting it sit in the room. "I am going to tell you exactly what happens next. You are going to take out your radio, and you are going to call Captain Beverly Holt. You are going to wake her up, and you are going to tell her she has 20 minutes to reach this address. If she is not standing in this kitchen in 20 minutes, my next call is to Special Agent Diane Stokes of the FBI's Charlotte Field Office, a woman I have worked alongside on 4 federal task forces, who will answer my call at any hour of the night, and who will not need me to explain more than 2 sentences before she understands exactly what is required." Braddock's hand moved toward the radio on his belt, with the mechanical slowness of a man executing an instruction his body has agreed to before his mind has fully caught up. Across the street behind the plantation shutters of his bay window, Philip Granger was watching the flashing lights bounce off the cobblestones of Renfield Drive, and feeling a slow, warm satisfaction move through him like the first glass of a very good evening. He went to bed before the lights went out. He slept without difficulty, the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a man who believes he has just corrected an imbalance in the natural order of things, and who has not yet learned that the camera at the gas station off Route 49 records in high definition to a cloud server that does not delete its files for 90 days. Captain Beverly Holt arrived in 19 minutes, half in uniform, her collar skewed, driving with the speed of someone who has been given information over the phone that she does not yet fully understand, but recognizes instinctively as the kind of information that requires her to be somewhere before anyone else gets there first. She absorbed the scene in the rapid, experienced assessment of a 24-year department survivor. The shattered mahogany door in the foyer, the books pulled from shelves, visible through the open study doors, and Judge Vivian Okafor seated at the marble island in her silk robe, writing on a yellow legal pad with a gold pen, her reading glasses on, not looking up when Holt entered. Holt opened her mouth. "Don't," Vivian said, without looking up, finishing the sentence she was in the middle of. She capped the pen. Then she raised her eyes. And what Holt found in Vivian's expression was not anger, and was not grief, and was not the stunned disorientation of someone processing what had just happened to them. It was the expression of a woman who was already several moves ahead of the conversation they were about to have, and who intended to remain there. Vivian's demands were delivered like items on a court-order body camera footage from all 3 officers to the FBI field office by 8 in the morning. A full written accounting of the warrant application process, The name of every officer who had entered this property documented in a federal filing by noon. Then she told Holt to get out of her house. Holt drove Braddock and the team back to the 14th precinct herself, and the conversation in the car was held just above a whisper for the entire length of the drive. The kind of conversation that requires people to sit close together in an enclosed space and speak very carefully, because the words they are saying are not words that any of them wants to exist in a form that can be recovered later. In a conference room at the precinct, blinds drawn, door closed, Holt laid it out with the controlled efficiency of a woman who had survived 4 police chiefs and 3 departmental reorganizations by understanding that the first 24 hours after a serious incident were the hours that determined everything that came after. The tip was anonymous. She said no trail back to the department. The warrant had been signed by a sitting circuit court judge, which provided procedural cover regardless of how thin the affidavit had been. The entry had been executed with excessive force, yes, but Braddock could construct a low-light conditions argument, a perceived non-compliance narrative documentation that the team had followed established protocol given the intelligence available. It was thin, but thin was something. And thin, properly managed in the first 24 hours, had a way of becoming defensible. The footage, she said, was the variable. Everything else they could manage. Some color had returned to Braddock's face during the drive, and sitting across from Holt's measured, practiced calm, he felt the beginnings of a calculation assembling itself in the space where panic had been an hour ago. One woman, against a department with 24 years of institutional infrastructure behind it. The warrant was signed. The affidavit existed. If documentation was made consistent tonight, if the body camera narrative was controlled before any external request came in, this was a bad outcome, but it was a manageable one. At 4:09 in the morning, Holt picked up the conference room phone and dialed Terrence Obie's personal number. Terrence was 39 and had worked in the department's IT division for 11 years. The quiet, reliable kind of infrastructure employee whose competence was consistently taken for granted and whose judgment had never in 11 years been tested in the specific way it was about to be tested now. Holt's voice was quiet and controlled. She instructed him to access the body camera server logs from Braddock's unit and to review the files for technical irregularities before any federal records request came in, framing it as ensuring the integrity of the evidentiary record using language that was precise enough to communicate what she wanted without ever stating it directly enough to constitute an explicit instruction to do something that had a clear criminal name. She used the word sanitize once, caught it smoothed over it immediately, and did not use it again. Terrence listened. He said he understood. He hung up. Then he sat in his apartment kitchen with his notepad in front of him and wrote down the exact time of the call, 4:09 a.m. He wrote down Holt's exact words, as many as he could recall verbatim, including the words she had caught and smoothed over because he had noticed the catch and had understood exactly what the catch meant. He looked at what he had written for a long time, long enough for his coffee to go cold on the counter beside him. Then he sat back in his chair and thought carefully and with a seriousness he had not expected to feel at 4 in the morning in his own kitchen about what kind of person he was going to be when he put the notepad down. At 4:52 in the morning, Terrence Obie called the FBI's Charlotte field office. The last patrol vehicle pulled away from Renfield Drive at 3:38 in the morning. Vivian watched the taillights disappear around the bend from the frame of her destroyed front doorway. The warm October air moving against her face, the neighborhood completely still around her, in the particular way that places are still after something has happened in them, that the places themselves have not yet processed. Then she went inside. She stepped carefully over the remains of the mahogany door where it lay in the foyer, walked through the living room, past the books that had been swept from the shelves, walked into the kitchen and sat down on the floor. Not at the island. On the floor itself, in the exact spot where they had held her down, the faint impression of her cheek still visible in the hardwood if you knew to look for it. She had made this bargain with herself years ago during a trial in Richmond that had required her to sit for 4 days and hear testimony that no person should have to hear without the benefit of being allowed to respond to it. The bargain being that she was permitted 30 seconds, no more and no less, to simply be in what had happened before she was required to move through it. 30 seconds was what she allowed. Not more, because more was not available to her and had not been available to her since she was old enough to understand what was required of someone in the position she had chosen to occupy. She looked at her wrists. The bruising from the zip ties had moved beyond violet into something deeper, the compressed tissue tender and hot, when she pressed her thumb gently against the inside of one wrist and held it there, feeling the ache of it without looking away. She was 53 years old. She had graduated Harvard Law in the top 4% of her class. She had argued before the 11th Circuit at 31. She had been appointed to the federal bench by a sitting president, confirmed by the Senate with bipartisan support, and had served 11 years on the 4th Circuit without a single complaint filed to the Judicial Council. She had been awarded the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Excellence Honor, twice had been zip-tied on the hardwood floor of her own kitchen by a man who called her sweetheart, and had never asked her name, and who had laughed when she told him he was making a mistake. She breathed in for 4 counts and held for 4 and released. Her mother's voice, the one she carried with her everywhere, in every room, in every moment when the work required more than she thought she had left. As long as you are still standing, they have not finished you. Take your breath back, then take everything else. She stood up. She walked to the study, stepping around the books on the floor without looking at them. She picked up the carved wooden gavel from the corner of the desk, and she held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of it and the smoothness of the wood at the grip where her mother's hands had held it at the investiture ceremony, before placing it in hers. And she thought about that morning, and about her mother's face in that moment, and about the courthouse steps in the photograph that was now lying on the kitchen floor with a cracked frame. She set the gavel back in its place. Then she sat down, opened the yellow legal pad to a clean page, wrote the time at the top, 3:44 a.m., and began writing names. When she had written every name she could recall, every badge number, every voice, she picked up the phone and called Diane Stokes. Stokes answered on the second ring alert, because in 7 years of working alongside Vivian, she had developed an instinct for what a call at this hour meant. Vivian told her everything in under 5 minutes precisely and without embellishment, and then gave one specific instruction. The body camera servers mirrored remotely under an emergency federal mandate before the 5 a.m. shift change. Silent and without internal alerts. The footage in federal custody before anyone at the 14th precinct had the opportunity to decide what the footage should look like. A pause on Stokes's end. Then, "You already know what they're going to do." "I've tried 38 police misconduct cases," Diane Vivian said. "I know exactly what they're going to do. I need it on record the moment they do it." She ended the call, turned back to the legal pad, and kept writing. Philip Granger set his alarm 45 minutes later than his usual time because he had been awake past 2 watching the lights, and felt with the comfortable self-satisfaction of a man who considers his own comfort a reasonable reward for civic contribution that he had earned a small indulgence. He made his coffee ground fresh, carried the mug to the bay window, and looked across at number 7 Renfield Drive, with the settled anticipation of a man who expects to see the satisfying aftermath of something he has set in motion working out exactly as he imagined it would. He expected crime scene tape. He expected the particular imposed silence of a property that has been officially disrupted. The yellow markers, the official notices, the visible declaration that the natural order had been restored by the proper mechanisms. He expected, if he was honest with himself in the way that comfortable people sometimes are in private, to feel the vindication of a man who had seen something that needed addressing and had addressed it, who had done what the community required of someone in his position. Instead, he saw 4 black government Suburbans parked in a precise and deliberate line along the cobblestone driveway of number 7, and men and women in dark suits and tactical windbreakers moving around the property with the organized efficiency of people who had done this specific kind of work many times before. The letters on their backs were visible even from across the street in the October morning light. FBI. Granger lowered his coffee mug. He assumed with the particular deep confidence of a man whose assumptions have gone unchallenged for so long that he has mistaken them for perception that the FBI's presence confirmed everything he had suspected. The operation had simply been larger than the local department could handle alone. He had been right, and the situation had merely been more significant than even he had realized. He picked up his phone and opened the neighborhood text chain and began composing a message about vigilance and the importance of communities paying attention to what happens on their streets. 3 sharp knocks on his front door. He walked to the foyer with the unhurried composure of a man who has in 61 years never had cause to feel afraid of an unexpected visitor, and pulled the door open with the pleasant, slightly self-important expression of a man receiving people whose presence confirms his relevance. Special Agent Diane Stokes stood on his porch in a charcoal suit that communicated without any additional elaboration that she was not there to have a pleasant conversation. Behind her, 2 agents stood with their hands resting at their belts. Her face offered absolutely nothing in the way of social warmth or reassurance, and in her right hand she held a small digital recorder which she raised without preamble and pressed play. Granger's own voice filled the quiet October morning of Renfield Drive, frantic and fabricated, specific, and detailed the breathless, rehearsed performance of a man who had believed he was calling a tip line and had not considered what it would feel like to hear himself played back in front of witnesses. Yes, I saw them. Armed. Duffel bags, big ones. The smell from the garage is chemical. It's a danger to this entire community. You have to send someone now. The recorder clicked off. Stokes told him about the prepaid phone and the cash purchase, and his registered Cadillac Escalade parked directly in front of the exterior security camera that recorded in high definition to a cloud server. She told him about the cell tower data. She told him who lived at 7 Renfield Drive. She told him what had happened to that woman at 2 in the morning because of what he had said into a tip-line phone from the back of his closed garage. He opened his mouth. I was only trying to protect. She did not let him finish. Philip Granger was walked out of his own front door in handcuffs, still in his bathrobe on a beautiful October morning. While the neighbors he had spent 12 years managing and steering and keeping in careful alignment watched from their lawns and driveways in a silence that, if you had been paying close attention to that neighborhood for any length of time, contained very little surprise. Agent Stokes brought 10 agents through the front doors of the 14th Precinct at 9:22 in the morning, with the organized, unhurried precision of people who feel no particular anxiety about the work they are there to do because they have done it before, and they have the paperwork and they know exactly how it ends. They split immediately upon entry pairs to the exits, individuals to server terminals, a calm and total occupation of the space that left the precinct's regular officers standing at their desks with the particular bewilderment of people who understand something significant is happening and have no useful role in it. Stokes walked directly to Captain Holt's office and pushed the door open without knocking, and the wood swung back against the wall, stop with a crack that silenced the bullpen. She placed the building-wide federal warrant on the desk. She told Holt that the body camera servers had been mirrored at 4:52 in the morning under an emergency federal mandate issued pursuant to Judge Okafor's authority as the presiding judge over the department's existing consent decree, and that the unedited footage was in federal custody. Then she told her about Terrence Obie, about the 409 call, about his notepad with the exact time and the exact words, and the word that Holt had caught and smoothed over and had believed would not exist anywhere in a recoverable form. Holt's face did not change. She had survived too many rooms to let her face change in a room like this. But something behind her eyes went very still, and it communicated to anyone in the room who was paying attention that she understood exactly what had happened. Vivian had not merely reported the raid. She had anticipated the cover-up positioned the mirror before Holt made the call and waited for Holt to walk into it with her eyes open. Stokes looked at Braddock. She produced the warrant timestamp log, his name, his badge number, his individual sign-off, no co-signature, no senior authorization. The warrant had been his alone from the moment it was constructed. She placed beside it the forensic trace on the anonymous tip, the gas station footage Granger's Escalade at the counter, and told him that the tip that had anchored his warrant had been called in by Vivian's next-door neighbor, a man who was angry that a black woman had purchased the most expensive home on his street. She put the handcuffs on the table between them. 4 minutes, she said. Courtroom 4B of the federal building in uptown Charlotte held none of the warmth of a Georgian study or a rose garden or a kitchen where a woman had once stood at a marble island with a glass of water at 2 a.m. before the world came through her front door. It was marble and fluorescent efficiency and mahogany railings and the specific institutional gravity of a room that has processed many serious things and intends to process another one today. On a Tuesday in early July, it was very full, the gallery packed and the press section overflowing into the side aisles, and the particular electric stillness that settles over a room when the people in it understand they are witnessing something that will be remembered had been present since before the proceedings opened. At the defense table in civilian clothes sat 4 people who had collectively made a set of choices across a single October night that had dismantled their careers, ended their freedom, and put them in this room. Philip Granger, in a navy suit that was slightly too large for the weight he had lost over the preceding months, sitting very still with his hands in his lap and his eyes mostly on the table in front of him. Carl Braddock, gray-faced with the rigid, effortful stillness of a man holding himself together through the application of sheer will. Shane Pruitt, who was 27 now and looked younger than that in the way that frightened people sometimes do. And Beverly Holt, whose composure had survived the arrest, the processing, the preliminary hearings, and every conversation between then and now, sitting with her hands flat on the defense table and giving nothing away. Presiding was the Honorable Judge Robert Calloway, 67 years old, a colleague of Vivian's for 19 years. A man who had begun his legal career in the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division in the 1980s, and who had spent 4 decades watching every variation of institutional power used against the people it was supposed to serve. He was not theatrical. He did not grandstand or use the bench as a stage for speeches. He sentenced with the same quiet, deliberate precision with which he did everything, and the people who had appeared before him had learned that the absence of drama did not indicate the absence of gravity, because the gravity was always there. It was simply expressed through the exactness of his words, rather than the volume of them. Vivian sat in the second row of the gallery in a charcoal linen blazer with a leather portfolio on her lap, not in any official capacity. She had played no formal role in the prosecution of this case. She was there as herself. Calloway began with Granger. He said that he wanted to be precise about what Granger had done because imprecision allows people to construct more comfortable versions of the truth than the facts support, and the facts here did not support a comfortable version. Granger had not made a mistake. He had not acted from genuine civic concern. He had watched a black woman move into a house more beautiful than his own, and had found that he could not tolerate it. And he had used a federal communications network to transmit fabricated statements that he knew and intended would result in a violent law enforcement response at her address. It would not have mattered if he had known who she was, Calloway said, and he wanted that to be absolutely clear, because the argument that the outcome would have been different if Granger had known Vivian's title was an argument that located the wrong in her identity rather than in his conduct, and the wrong was entirely in his conduct. For federal wire fraud, making false statements to law enforcement and civil rights violations, Calloway sentenced Philip Granger to 72 months in a federal correctional institution without the possibility of early release. The sound Granger made was very small. His attorney's hand moved toward him and stopped. Pruitt had cooperated fully from the beginning, and his testimony about the pre-raid briefing had been a meaningful component of the government's case. Calloway noted both things and reflected them in the sentence. He also noted that they did not erase the footage and that nothing would, because in that kitchen, in that specific moment, Pruitt had made a choice to use force against a compliant, unarmed woman, and he had made it because nothing in his 2 years on the force had given him any reason to hesitate, and that was a failure that extended beyond him and would be addressed through the structural reforms that were already underway. But he was the man who had been in that kitchen, and he was the one who would answer for the choice made there. 48 months. Pruitt closed his eyes. Weston had been the first to cooperate the most complete in his account, and the most honest about his own failure, which was not the failure of action, but the failure to stop an action he had recognized in real time as wrong. 24 months, supervised release. He received it without visible reaction because he had spent the past several months expecting it, and had finished whatever reacting he needed to do somewhere private and alone. The moral witness had chosen in the end to witness accurately. The sentence reflected that. Holt received 96 months for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to destroy federal evidence. Her attempt during cooperation negotiations to position herself as a passive bystander to Braddock's decisions had not survived contact with the 409 call log and Terrence Obie's notepad, and the prosecution had not been inclined toward leniency for a senior officer who had chosen in the hours when accountability was still possible to reach for erasure instead. The tightening around Holt's jaw was the only thing that moved in her face. Then it sealed again. Calloway turned to Braddock last. He said that Braddock was not the architect of the prejudice that had produced the anonymous tip, and that Granger's bias had existed long before Braddock received his phone call, and that he wanted to be clear about that distinction, because clarity about where each piece of responsibility belongs is what separates judgment from punishment. But Braddock had taken that bias and built something with it. A warrant. A narrative. A team of armed officers sent into a federal judge's home at 2 a.m. on the strength of a fabricated tip that 5 minutes of basic verification would have exposed as fiction. He had not done that verification because the bust was the point, and the quarterly numbers were the point, and who was in that house, and what might happen if he simply took 7 minutes to check was a question he had chosen with full professional awareness not to ask. For civil rights conspiracy, deprivation of rights under color of law, and abuse of official authority, Calloway sentenced Carl Braddock to 120 months in a federal correctional institution. 10 years. The gavel came down with the flat, decisive sound of a door closing permanently. In the second row, Vivian watched the federal marshals move toward the defense table. She watched Granger's knees buckle slightly when the handcuffs were applied. She watched Braddock stand without assistance and walk toward the side door without looking back at anything in the room. She did not feel triumph. What she felt was older and quieter than triumph, a deep and exhausted recognition that something long overdue had finally arrived where it needed to be, and that the arriving had cost exactly what these things always cost, which was everything. She thought of her mother's voice. "As long as you are still standing." She picked up her portfolio. She stood. She straightened her blazer and walked out into the hallway because she had oral arguments at 2 o'clock, and she was already thinking about them. 1 year to the week from the day the moving trucks had rolled up the cobblestone driveway, Vivian walked out into the rose garden on a Saturday morning with a watering can and worked the water slowly along the base of the oldest plant, the one that had been the most overgrown when she arrived and had taken the longest to come back. The roses were fully in bloom now, red and white, their fragrance carrying over the garden wall and into the morning air, in the way that things do when they have been given the time and the attention they require. Through the study window, she could see the carved wooden gavel on the corner of the desk return to its place, and on the shelf beside it, the framed photograph of herself and her mother on the courthouse steps. The glass replaced the image clear. The family who had moved into the house across the street, a couple and their small daughter, were in the driveway with sidewalk chalk. And the little girl looked up and saw Vivian watching and raised one arm in a wave, the chalk still in her hand, leaving a pink arc above the cobblestones. Vivian raised her hand in return. The little girl went back to her drawing. The mahogany front door had been replaced within a week. Same wood, same craftsman, same design, slightly heavier than the original by Vivian's specific request. She did not leave Caldwell Heights. She did not ask for a transfer or a security detail or any acknowledgement from the courthouse of what had happened in her kitchen. In the months that followed the sentencing, she expanded the consent decree's scope considerably more. Oversight provisions, stronger body camera accountability, an independent civilian review board with real authority, a requirement that all no-knock warrant applications be reviewed by a federal magistrate before any local judge signs them. The 14th Precinct's Narcotics Command was rebuilt from the ground up under direct court supervision because a structure that has rotted at its foundation does not get repaired, it gets rebuilt. On the morning after sentencing, her law clerk set a fresh cup of coffee on her desk without saying a word. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up the gold pen her mother had given her, opened the yellow legal pad to a clean page, wrote the date at the top, and began. There was always more justice to be served, and she had never once in 23 years been late for it. If this story moved you, if you believe that no one, not even the people who are supposed to protect us, should be above the law, smash the like button and subscribe to our channel, because we tell these stories so that the people who were never supposed to be seen can finally be heard. Leave us a comment and tell us when Vivian pushed herself up from that floor without asking for help. What did that moment mean to you?